August 1884. The white sun comes down like heated iron, and the man standing in the middle of his own yard, no gun, no backup, nothing but open hands, stares straight into 20 Apache warriors holding their horses at the eastern fence line. From the south, the thunder of town horses, rifle barrels catching the light, one man. Between two walls closing in, nobody knew it started with a cup of water. Nobody knew this man had been dead inside for 3 years before that afternoon found him. And nobody knew not yet that the woman stepping out of the barn door right now, head unbowed, spine straight as a fence post that finally holds, was the one who would pull him back. But first, there is a fire that has to be walked through. The desert doesn't forgive August, not the way people say a place forgives, with softness, with relief, with the particular exhale of tension leaving a room. Arizona in August is not a place that exhales. It presses, it accumulates. The heat that comes down from the white sky at noon is not the same heat that rises from the cracked earth at 2 in the afternoon. And both of them are different from the heat that sits in the rocks at dusk and radiates back into a man's face as he works. Patient and relentless, the way only things without opinions can be patient and relentless. Wade Colton had been working this particular piece of ground for 3 years. He was 41 years old, and the sun had done to his face what it does to leather left out too long, not ruined it, exactly, but committed it, made it permanent. The lines around his eyes had been there since his late 20s. Put there by squinting into distances that didn't have anything in them but more distance, and the years since had simply confirmed them, deepened them, made them part of the architecture of the man rather than a commentary on the life he'd been living. He'd spent 18 years as a working cowboy before he became whatever he was now. 18 years driving cattle up from Texas through the Indian Territory into Kansas, sleeping under stars that burned with the specific indifference of things too far away to care what was happening below them. He'd learned to read weather by the way air changed its smell an hour before the change arrived, to read ground by the way water ran after rain, to read horses by the angle of their ears and the particular tension in their haunches when something in the brush needed noticing. He'd been good at the work, not talented in the showy way, but reliable in the way that other cowboys with 20 years of experience noticed and didn't comment on, because men in that profession communicated respect through proximity and repetition rather than words. In 1878, he quit. Clara had said she understood, which was true, and she'd said she'd prefer a husband who came home, which was truer. He used 18 years of accumulated wages to buy 40 acres in Kansas with dark soil, and a creek running through one corner, and for 3 years he and Clara had built something there that he still couldn't describe with any precision. Because happiness experienced from the inside doesn't announce itself as happiness. It just is, and you only understand its shape after you're outside of it, looking back. Joseph arrived in the spring of 1879, 4 pounds at birth, which frightened everyone paying attention. Then 6 pounds at a month, then 12. Then running through the kitchen with a wooden spoon making sounds that Wade could only describe as triumphant, and the fear dissolved into something that pressed on the inside of his chest from the opposite direction. The winter of 1881 came in with purpose. The cough arrived first, the kind a man tells himself is ordinary because most coughs are ordinary, and the ordinary explanation is almost always correct. Then Clara's fever started on a Tuesday. By Thursday, Joseph had it too. The doctor was 20 miles out, and the snow was doing what Kansas snow does when it decides to be serious about it. Wade rode out into it. He came back with the medicine. The house was quiet in the way that houses are quiet when something inside them has changed permanently. He stood in the bedroom doorway long enough for the candle he was carrying to burn past his fingers, and he didn't feel the burn, and he didn't cry. The crying came later, without warning, in the barn one afternoon while he was doing something ordinary, the way grief locates the unguarded moments rather than the expected ones. He sold the Kansas land that spring and drove west until Arizona told him to stop. Not literally. The desert doesn't speak. But there's a specific point, riding west through increasingly severe country, where the landscape becomes so indifferent to human suffering that it starts to feel like a solution not to the grief, but to the constant requirement of performing recovery for people who knew Clara, who remembered Joseph's name, who looked at Wade with the particular careful attention of people watching for signs that he was going to be all right, when all right was not currently available. Out here, no one was watching for signs. He bought the hardest parcel he could find, 40 acres of hardpan and rock and calcified argument, 3 days' hard ride from the nearest settlement, with one attribute that made it worth the price and several that made the price affordable. The attribute was the well, 60 feet deep in the northwest corner, with water at the bottom of it that was cold and consistent and unglamorous in the manner of things that simply do what they do without requiring acknowledgement. Wade had lowered a bucket on the first day he viewed the property, felt the weight of water coming up, and made his decision before the bucket cleared the rim. An 18-year cowboy understands water the way other people understand money, not as comfort, but as the thing that all other things depend on. The well was the argument. The 40 acres were the footnotes. The house was falling. The barn was nearly failing. The fencing had strong opinions about geometry that didn't match Wade's. And the soil had decided 2 or 3 previous owners ago that it was done producing things, and had maintained that position with the stubborn consistency of something that has made its peace with its own conclusion. He hadn't named the 3 horses. This was strange, and he knew it was strange. A man who'd worked horses for 18 years names them not out of sentiment, but out of practicality, because a named animal responds differently than an unnamed one, and you need the response. The bay was the bay. The roan was the roan. The grey mare was the grey mare, and she regarded him sometimes with the patient, mild disappointment of a creature that has accurately assessed the situation and decided to wait it out. He wasn't ready to attach names to things he was going to lose. On the morning of August 14th, the temperature reached 104 degrees before 9 o'clock, and Wade was at the east fence line, which had been defeating him for the better part of a season. The fence wanted to lean south. He wanted it vertical. 2 months of this negotiation had produced a working stalemate that satisfied neither party. He was driving a post into ground that gave up every inch with maximum resistance. Sweat ran from his nose to the dirt and evaporated before it landed, which was one of the things about this country he'd never stopped noticing, the speed with which it erased evidence. In Kansas, sweat became part of the earth. Here, the air itself declined to let things arrive. He didn't hear the footsteps so much as feel them. A change in the texture of the silence behind him, something added to it that hadn't been there before, and 18 years of professional alertness responded before the part of his brain that used words could catch up. His hand hit his belt. He turned. Lindstrom stood 20 paces back. Apache, he could read that from the first glance, the same way he could read weather and ground and the mood of a river crossing. Young. All 3 of them thin in the way that hunger produces over time. Not absence of food for a day or 2, but the gradual redistribution of everything not strictly necessary to survival. Their clothes had been worn past their original intention, gray with distance, fraying at every edge where fabric had taken on too much world. One of them had shoes. The others had cloth wrapped around their feet with the careful layers of someone treating a wound. They carried nothing that could be called a weapon. The woman in front was small, quick in the way small people are quick, density rather than fragility, and she raised one hand with the deliberate slowness of someone who has learned to move carefully around things that might startle. Palm out, not surrender. The gesture of approach. Her eyes went past him, to the well. She didn't speak. The direction of her gaze was more precise than words would have been. Wade stood with his hammer and his argument about the fence post and looked at the 3 women, and looked at the well and looked back. Something practical in him was running calculations about a lone man and 3 strangers and 20 miles of nothing in every direction. Something older and quieter was running different numbers entirely. The water was not plentiful out here. It never was. But scarcity and gone were different things, and a man who watched 3 people die of thirst to protect a resource he had enough of was not the man Wade Colton wanted to be standing in front of when the final accounting came. He nodded. Once. Short as a closing door, they came to the well with the care of people who have learned that offers can be withdrawn. The small one worked the handle, lowered the bucket. When it came up, all 3 of them drank, and not one drop was wasted, not a splash. Not an overflow, not the casual spillage of a person who assumes the next bucketful is already on its way. Wade had given water to men who'd been riding through this same heat for hours and watched them slosh it across the ground in their hurry. These 3 women treated every swallow like they'd done the arithmetic on it. He watched the tallest one, the one who'd been standing slightly apart from the other two, even before they reached the well. In the way people stand slightly apart when they're the reason the group is moving in a particular direction. She drank last, less than the others, despite being the one who looked most used up by whatever road had brought them here. She looked at Wade once, directly, without performing any particular emotion about it, and then she looked east, toward the horizon, toward whatever she was always measuring herself against. When they finished, the small one set something down at his feet and stepped back, a bracelet, woven from plant fiber, beaded in white and brown and one shade of blue that had no practical reason to be as precise as it was, every knot pulled tight. Every bead placed with the attention of someone who wasn't rushing. This wasn't an hour's work. This was something made by a person who sat with it, payment. The word arrived in his chest before his mind had assembled the sentence. Not a gift, not a gesture. Payment, which meant the water had been a transaction, which meant they hadn't been begging, which meant something about the three women that Wade found himself turning over the way you turn over something you want to understand, rather than something you want to get rid of. He looked up. They were gone. The rocks to the east offered nothing. No dust, no sound, no evidence of direction. The only proof the three women had been in his yard was the bracelet in his palm and 3 wet circles in the dirt around the base of his well where water had dripped from the bucket's edge. He put the bracelet in his shirt pocket and went back to the fence post, but the question stayed. They followed him through the afternoon the way the smell of smoke follows a man not visible, not something you can put a hand on, but definitely present. The specific thing that sat in him and wouldn't lie down was this. Those 3 women had not moved like people who were lost. Lost people drift, they weave, they arrive sideways, stumbling, with the incoherence of people who have been going too long without enough of whatever they needed. These 3 had come to his well in a straight line, with the certainty of people who knew the well was there and had walked toward it on the strength of that knowledge, which meant someone had told them, which meant they weren't alone. Dusk in Arizona comes like a decision rather than a gradual change of mind. The light goes gold, and then orange, and then the bruised purple that makes even hardpan look valuable, and then it's night, completely and without the transitional softness that some climates provide. Wade was closing the barn when he noticed the latch was secured. The door was not fully shut, a gap of 3 inches that he would not have left because he had not left it once in 3 years, not on any evening. Because the latch on this door had a weak point on the left side and the Big Bay had opinions about gaps in doors that related to his opinions about personal freedom. Wade pushed the door wide and stood in the entrance for 10 full seconds, clean. Not tidied cleaned, which is a different thing. The difference between pushing things to the edges and taking everything apart and putting it back right. The straw was stacked with right angles sharp enough to suggest someone had cared about the corners. The harness hung from hooks he'd forgotten the wall possessed oiled, he confirmed when he touched one, and coiled in the proper direction. The floor had been swept past the dust layer to the bare grey boards beneath, which he hadn't seen in at least 2 seasons. His 3 horses stood brushed to a shine, their coats returning the last of the light like river stones, their troughs full with fresh feed measured carefully, not generously, not carelessly, carefully. They had come back. 3 women had returned to his property while he was working fence 200 yards away and done all of this, brushed 3 horses that didn't know them, swept a floor, sorted gear, filled troughs, and he had heard nothing. Not the door on its hinges which creaked. Not the movement of women working close together in an enclosed space. Not the particular sound horses make when strangers enter, which is a sound Wade had been hearing for 18 years. And would have identified from a significant distance, even without trying. They had crossed his land like weather, like something that happens to a place. He walked the property in the failing light and searched for sign the way he'd been trained to search bootprint, disturbed stone, blade of dry grass pressed in the wrong direction. The ground that had been teaching him its language for 3 years gave him nothing. Not a mark, not a trace. The packed desert floor around the barn was as blank as if no one had moved across it in days. That bothered him more than the cleaned barn. Tracks tell you numbers. Numbers tell you what to prepare for. People who leave no tracks are people you cannot count, and in country this far from anywhere, The things you cannot count are the things that will find you unprepared at the worst possible moment. He cooked supper and ate it without tasting it, and sat at the small table with the bracelet out of his pocket, and beside his plate, his eyes returning to it more than to the food. Clara had made things with this quality of attention, different work, her own patterns with thread and small river shells, and the care evident in the knotting reminded him of the care evident in her work, which was not a comfortable thought and was apparently not a thought he had any power to prevent. He climbed to the barn loft. The cot up there had been his bed for the better part of 3 years. The house had a bedroom, but the bedroom had a quality of weight to it at night that the loft didn't. Less ceiling, more sky, the sound of horses shifting below him, no windows facing the direction of Kansas. He lay back and let the day do what days do to a body that has been working since before sunrise seem reached for him. And then footsteps. Not close, not at the barn, but out on the open ground, east of the well, where nothing should be moving at this hour except coyotes, and coyotes moved differently. Multiple sets, the specific syncopated rhythm of human feet on hard ground, and more than 3 pairs of them, and growing in number as he lay there and counted. He was across the loft and at the window before the count reached 6. The horizon was wrong. He had been looking at this particular horizon for 3 years from this particular window, and he knew it the way a man knows his own handwriting, the specific blank line of it, the dark and clean division between earth and sky, the total absence of anything interrupting it. The horizon he knew was gone. In its place, scattered across the desert floor to the east and running south along what his mental map told him was the dry wash 3 miles out, lights, small, orange, moving with the patient, measured drift of people who have a destination and are not in a hurry about arriving. He counted. Lost the count at somewhere between 20 and 30 because the lights kept shifting, blurring together and separating again, a whole constellation come loose from the sky and settled in the sand, all of them moving toward his 40 acres, his well. The 3 women that morning had not been travelers who happened on his water by luck. They'd been sent ahead to find the well, to find the man, to find out what kind of man he was. The clean barn was not only gratitude, it was a report carried back. He gives water without questions, he raises no hand, he is alone. And now, whatever they'd reported to was walking toward him out of the dark, patient as the heat, carrying intentions he couldn't name from this distance. He sat at the loft window with a cup of cold coffee, and the Winchester propped against the wall beside him, loaded, ready, untouched. He didn't reach for it. He watched the lights and let the night run its course toward morning. And sometime before dawn his body decided he'd had enough time with his thoughts and took the decision away from him. He slept an hour, maybe less. Dawn in August doesn't negotiate. One moment the sky is black and the next it's the pink of a struck match. And then it's day, fully committed. The sun clearing the eastern mountains with the calm certainty of something that has never once worried about what it would find when it got there. Wade came down from the loft with his back stiff and his mind running at full speed and walked to the front of his property. His jaw came loose on its hinge. 25 women walked up the track toward his gate in a long ordered line, not a crowd, not a mob, not the disorganized mass of people in distress. A line. Each of them moving with the measured economy of people who have calculated exactly what a step costs and decided not to spend more than that. Young. All of them in varying degrees of the same accumulated exhaustion he'd seen on the first 3. Except spread across 25 faces it had more dimensions to it, not just the physical kind but the longer, deeper kind that accumulates over weeks of moving through hostile country while keeping enough alertness to survive it. He counted twice and arrived at the same number both times. At the front of the line, the small quick-eyed woman from yesterday, and beside her, the tall one, spine straight, shoulders level, head not bowed by any degree of the weight she was obviously carrying. She moved the way certain people move through the world. Like the space in front of her is simply where she's going, and the space behind her is where everything else has to catch up. They stopped 20 paces out. The desert silence that settled over all of them was the heaviest Wade had felt it since he'd arrived in this country, and he had been living inside desert silence for 3 years, so that said something specific about the weight of the moment. He opened his mouth. Nothing came. The small woman stepped forward. Her English arrived clean and precise, the speech of someone who had learned the language with intention and used it with the same intention. "My name is Peter. She is Kiona. She leads us. We come without weapons. We carry no trouble to your door. Wade worked his jaw until his voice came back, rougher than he intended from disuse. There's a considerable number of you. 25. Peter's eyes were quick and direct. Yesterday, 3 of us came for water. You gave it. No questions asked. Nothing required in return. She paused, and in the pause her eyes went over his face with the thorough, unhurried attention of someone reading a document they need to remember. That is not what we have found on this road. We have not found much of it anywhere. Wade made himself look at each of them, not assessing for threat reading, the way he read ground and weather, to understand what he was actually seeing rather than what he expected. Young women, most of them, all marked by the road in the specific ways a 3-week crossing of this desert marks people. One near the back of the line, barely 18, possibly younger, stood with her arms folded across her middle in a posture he recognized not from combat or confrontation, but from a bedroom in Kansas in the spring of 1879, from Clara in the months before Joseph arrived, both arms curved inward and pressing close to the thing she was responsible for. He looked away before she could catch him looking. The older woman beside her, gray-haired, slower on her feet than the rest, with the kind of stillness around her that accumulates in people who have been paying close attention to the world for 60-something years, met Wade's gaze with complete equanimity. Her eyes said, "You saw what you saw. It belongs to the girl, and I will be watching to see what you do with it." He gave her the smallest nod available. She returned it, precise, satisfied, and looked away. "Where do you come from?" Wade asked. Peter exchanged a look with Kiona. Kiona gave one small dip of her chin, the motion of releasing something held, and Peter told him they had been arranged for marriages they didn't choose. Older men in their community, widowers who needed the specific domestic labor a young wife represented and had standing enough to claim it. The women had not been consulted. The arrangements had been made the way arrangements are made when the people being arranged are understood as part of the arrangement rather than parties to it. So they had run. 27 of them had left the mountains 3 weeks ago. They had walked across desert that expressed no preference about whether they survived it, through temperatures that made the preference irrelevant, past water sources that were not where anyone had said they would be. They had lost 2 women to the crossing, buried them in ground hard as fired brick, dug with their bare hands, and then stood up and continued, because stopping was just a slower version of the same ending. Peter's voice didn't waver. That was somehow more difficult to hear than if it had. "We did not come to ask for charity." It was Kiona who spoke then, in English slower than Peter's but chosen with different care, each word placed the way you place something you want to stay where you put it. "We came to propose an arrangement. You gave water to 3 strangers. We returned and cleaned your barn. That was the beginning of the debt, not the end of it." Wade looked at her. She held the look without performance. "We examined your land while 3 of us drank yesterday." Her eyes moved briefly to the east fence line, the dead garden, the house negotiating with gravity. "One man cannot hold all of this. You have been losing ground here for longer than 1 season. That found a specific location. He didn't let it show. We know this desert as people who were born inside it," she continued with the same measured pace. "We can grow crops from soil that others have written off. We can repair what is broken. We weave cloth that people will travel distance to buy. Let us work your land through 1 full season. Then the debt between us is settled and we leave. You will have no further obligation, and neither will we." Wade looked at the 40 acres of his life arranged around him, the fence that kept winning, the garden that kept dying, the house that had decided gravity was making a valid argument. He looked at 25 women who had carried seeds in their pockets across 3 weeks of dying country, and considered those seeds worth the weight of carrying. Then Peter said, "There is something you must know before you decide. Something that changes the size of what you would be agreeing to." He waited. "Kiona is not only a woman who ran from a marriage she didn't choose. Her father is a chief." Peter's voice stayed level, which cost her something Wade could hear underneath the level. The marriage arranged for her was the seal on a peace agreement between 2 peoples who have been in conflict for 10 years. The night she left, the agreement tore. The people hunting us are not looking for a runaway bride. They are trying to repair a peace that is bleeding out every day she stays gone. 10 seconds of desert silence. "If you knew that when we first came to your well," Kiona said, Would you have given the water? Wade turned that question over. Honestly, the way he turned the bracelet. Held it against the light of what he knew about himself, which was more than he'd known 3 years ago and less than he'd known before Kansas. The water was already poured, he said. A man can't take back what he's already given, and I wouldn't want to. The rest is just the shape of what grew from it. Something shifted in Kiona's face. Not softness, more the expression of someone whose working hypothesis has just been confirmed by evidence. 3 rules, Wade said. We set them now, we're listening, Peter. Nobody enters my house without I ask them in, not to clean it. Not to bring anything. That door belongs to me. He held Peter's gaze until she nodded and turned to carry it down the line. 25 heads moved. Second, the well is shared and every drop treated like the last one available. Anyone lets water run to waste, we're done. No argument, no second chance. The nods came faster this time, with the quickness of people who don't need convincing about the value of water because they buried friends for the lack of it. Third, anyone from town rides out asking questions, you're hired hands. You came from a settlement a long distance south. You don't recall the exact name, that is the only story. And it's the same story in every mouth. Peter rendered the 3rd rule into Apache, low and quick. 25 women nodded as a single body. Then you have yourselves an arrangement. He looked at the house, which looked back with the skepticism of something long neglected being considered for the first time in years. Barn is yours. I'll take the house. Past time I did something about the place anyway. He hadn't finished the sentence before they moved. No signal that he could identify. No direction given, they simply divided and flowed into the corners of his property the way water divides when it finds the low ground, each person apparently already knowing what work was waiting for her. Some toward the east fence. Some toward the dead garden, kneeling in the cracked dirt, pressing their palms against it, reading it before touching it. A cluster circling the barn from the outside with the focused attention of people diagnosing a problem they intend to solve. Wade stood in the middle of his own yard and felt 3 years of carefully maintained solitude begin to come apart at the seams. Pitta came back to him. She stopped close and looked up with her quick dark eyes going briefly, unexpectedly still. Thank you. You don't know what this means. I hope I don't spend the next season finding out what it costs. Do you think you will? He thought about it the way he'd been trying to think about things since Kansas, with honesty rather than comfort. No, I think I'll be fine. A pause. It's everything else I'm not certain about. He went to get the blankets, and Wade Colton, Cowboy, widower, self-elected exile. Man who had spent 3 years learning how not to want things, stood in the kitchen of his own house, pulling blankets from a cedar chest, and felt the specific sensation of something he had successfully amputated from his daily experience, beginning to grow back. Hope, returning the way circulation returns to a numb limb, not pleasant, not what you'd call comfortable, but undeniable evidence that something was working again that hadn't been working before. They worked like the land owed them something, which maybe it did. 40 acres that had been losing the argument with one tired man for 3 seasons seemed to recognize something in 25 pairs of hands that asked different questions of it. By the end of the first day, the east fence ran straight to both corners, the fence that had been defeating Wade since spring. The garden had been turned and rowed and seeded from the small cloth pouches the women had carried on their bodies through 3 weeks of desert crossing. Seeds considered worth the wait when they had almost nothing else to carry. 10 women on the fence, moving in a rhythm with no conductor. Post held plumb, wire strung. Next post moved into position, the whole operation running with the efficiency of a machine that has settled all its internal arguments. 8 women in the garden, reading the soil with their palms before they planted in it, cutting curved channels in the cracked earth, not the straight rows Wade had attempted both previous seasons, but arcing lines that followed the slight drop in the east end of the plot, designed to catch and hold whatever water the sky occasionally provided. He'd been farming like a man from Kansas. 7 women in the barn, and through the open door came the sound of work scraping, straightening, the low, precise conversation of people solving a shared problem, and underneath the work sounds threaded through them, singing, not performed, not directed at anyone. The sound of people who have finally found a place safe enough to let the rest of themselves surface. Low and unhurried, a pattern that repeated and varied and repeated again, and the back of Wade's throat did something unexpected when he heard it. He turned away before anyone could see his face. Kiona came to him across the yard that afternoon, not quickly, not with urgency, but with the measured stride of someone who moves through every space as if she's already decided where she's going before she starts moving. She looked at the house, not at him, at the south end of the roof, which had been losing its argument with rain and gravity at different speeds in different sections. "The south end," she said. "I know about the south end. It's worse than it looks from here. I know that too." The look she gave him then was the look of someone who has identified the gap between what a man knows and what a man acts on and has decided to name it without making it an accusation. "Tomorrow. First light. I'll help." He almost told her she didn't have to. Instead, "I start early, I know." She turned back toward the barn. Then over her shoulder, without breaking stride, "You cook." It wasn't a question. He looked at the cup in his hand, then at the kitchen window, then at the 25 women who had apparently been cataloguing the smells from that kitchen through the barn wall and had decided that the catalogue was relevant to the arrangement. "I was wondering when that was going to come up. We have been polite about it for a full day." A pause, the brief kind that contains a judgment. "We're done being polite about it," which was how 26 people came to eat supper together that first evening around a fire in the yard, Wade cooking with an audience for the first time in 3 years. Which should have been uncomfortable, and initially was, and then stopped being, because cooking is a specific kind of work that takes over the worrying portion of the mind, and leaves the rest of the person free to simply be present. Being present was something he hadn't practiced in a while. Ruth, the older woman, the gray-haired one who had looked at him over Ada's head that morning with the eyes of someone issuing a silent contract, sat on a stone near the fire with a basket she was working on. Her hands never stopped, but her attention moved across the yard with the patient thoroughness of someone doing an assessment that has been running since morning. She watched Wade cook. She watched the younger women eat. She watched the way Kiona moved through the group, not directing, never visibly directing, but present in a way that everything else organized itself around without appearing to. Peter translated the evening's conversation for the women whose English didn't reach the words being used, and her translations produced ripples of response, occasional muffled laughter, the sound of people who had been carrying tension for 3 weeks encountering something that required a different response. Wade didn't ask what was funny. He suspected it was him. He found he didn't mind being the source of something that sounded like laughter. That night he lay in the front bedroom of the house for the first time in 8 months and listened to the distant soft sounds of 25 women settling into sleep in the barn, and the horses shifting below them, and the desert making its desert night sounds outside the walls. Not silence, the opposite of the silence he'd been living in, which was not noise exactly but weight. The weight of knowing the dark outside the window was full of people who were alive and would still be there in the morning. He hadn't known he'd forgotten what that felt like. Sleep arrived the way it arrives for the genuinely exhausted, not as a choice but as a physical event. By the end of the first week, Kiona was on his roof at first light, hammer in hand, and had been there since the morning after she said she would be. She'd located the hammer in the lean-to and rehabilitated it from a state Wade would have assessed as terminal. She worked the south end with the focus of someone for whom the problem in front of them is the only thing that currently exists, and Wade worked the north end, and they met somewhere in the middle around noon and sat on the peak with cornbread he'd made that morning and looked out at what the property had become from this angle. The garden's curved channels were visible from above in their full logic. The fence ran to its corners without apology. The barn stood squared. The well occupied its northwest position with the calm authority of something that knows its own value and doesn't need to announce it. "It looks different from up here," Wade said. "Most things do." Kiona looked east. She looked east with a regularity he had begun to notice, not anxious, but alert in the way of someone who knows what direction the next thing will come from and has decided to be the first one to see it. "When do you go to town?" "I was planning another week. But stores are moving faster with 26 mouths." He looked at the garden below. "How long before that gives us anything?" 3 weeks for the first things. 6 for the rest. I'll need to go sooner than I planned, and I'll need to buy double my usual order. That's going to raise questions in Red Rock Flats. Then you will need to have considered your answers before the questions are asked." She turned a nail in her fingers, examining it. You were a cowboy. 18 years. It shows in how you think about terrain. She set the nail and drove it in 2 clean strokes. In town, the terrain is people. Read it the same way. That was more useful than anything he'd come up with on his own. And he sat with it for the ride to Red Rock Flats 3 days later, when the flour bin scraped bottom and 26 people's reality asserted itself over whatever he'd been planning. The town came up out of the heat shimmer on the 3rd morning, weathered timber, resolving mile by mile into a main street and the buildings that did the work any settlement in this territory needed done. General store, blacksmith, saloon, sheriff's office. A church that doubled as a meeting hall, which had always struck Wade as sensible prioritization. He felt the town register his arrival before he saw a single face. That was Red Rock Flats. 300 people with limited entertainment had elevated noticing to a practiced skill, and a man arriving 3 days early on his regular schedule was, by local standards, an occasion. He tied off in front of Silas Reed's store, and the word was already moving ahead of him in the way words move through small places, through walls, around corners, arriving before the person it's about. Silas greeted him from behind the counter with genuine warmth. Wade. We were starting to think the desert had finally committed to the project. Still working on it. He set his list on the counter. Need everything on there. Double the usual on flour, cornmeal, beans, and salt. Silas read the list with the unhurried attention of a man who processes information for a living. His eyebrows performed a calculation. Double on the staples. That's a significant appetite for 1 man and 3 unnamed horses. Took on help. Place got too big for 1 set of hands. The bell above the door began its work. Grant Hooper came in first, broad-shouldered, honest-faced, the kind of man who says what he means because he was raised that way and hasn't found a good argument against it. Then Big Dutch from the blacksmith shop, forearms crossed in front of his chest, present in the way large people are present, occupying space by their nature rather than intention. And last, unhurried, arranging himself in the doorway with the practiced ease of someone who has been arriving places at exactly the right moment for his own purposes for a long time. Clem Baxter. Wade's gut registered him the way it registered uncertain river crossings, quietly, without drama, with the calm certainty that the ground ahead required more attention than it was showing. Baxter was lean and dressed better than his circumstances should have supported. His smile was the kind that started and stopped before it finished, perpetually half-built, and his eyes had the habit of going past whatever face they were aimed at, as if the real information was always located slightly behind the person he was talking to. 2 years prior, he'd ridden out to the Trang Trai with an offer to buy the 40 acres. He'd wanted the well. He'd been pleasant about it and specific about the price, and completely unambiguous about his intention to revisit the subject. Wade had declined in terms that were clear and not especially diplomatic, and Baxter had ridden away with the smile still half-built on his face and the eyes still running their calculations. And Wade had known in the specific way you know certain things about certain people that the subject was not closed. It was not closed now. Heard you took on help, Grant said. Straightforward, because Grant was straightforward. Short of hands out here. Where'd you find people willing to work 3 days from anything? People who needed the work. That's a lot of staples for 2 or 3 hands. Silas, still scooping flour, managing to be both neutral and pointed at the same time. Enough people to hold the place together. Baxter's voice came in light and easy. Funny thing, luck like that, help falling out of the sky just when a man needs it, the half-smile. The eyes going slightly past Wade's shoulder, makes a person curious about the details. Big Dutch unfolded his arms. We're not trying to crowd your business, Wade. But strangers out here become the county's business whether anybody means them to or not. And then there's the water question. He said it with the directness of someone raising something he knows is uncomfortable and doing it anyway because it needs raising. Your well is the only deep water in 30 miles of this county. More people at your well means people with cattle and fields and children are doing subtraction they don't want to do. Well, hasn't dropped 2 feet through 3 bad summers, Wade said. It held when every other source in the county was telling people to make other arrangements. It'll hold. How many people, though? Grant's gaze was level and patient. That's what sits underneath everything else. How many hands did you take on, Wade? The still's quiet. in the way it goes quiet when the conversation has arrived at the moment everyone came to witness. Wade could count the faces and calculate how fast whatever number he gave would reach how many ears, and the number was the thing he couldn't give them, and they all knew it. "Enough," he said, "and anyone who frets about the well is welcome to ride out and put their own eyes on it." "Maybe we'll do that," Baxter said, light as something placed on a scale to test it. Landing heavy anyway, Grant looked at Wade with the measured regard of a fair man who is not satisfied and is being honest about not being satisfied. "One more thing before you go. Sheriff Cross was asking after you week back." Wade's hand on the counter didn't move. "Reports on the wire. Apache women that separated from their people up north. The tribe's been searching hard by what comes through." Grant watched him with the careful attention of a man who is about to ask a question he suspects he already knows part of the answer to. "You see anything like that out your direction?" Wade held Grant Hooper's gaze, a man he respected and lied with everything he had. "Desert's a wide thing. What I see out there is coyotes and hawks and the decisions rattlesnakes make that don't work out for them. Nothing that walks on two legs." Grant nodded. "Slow, all right. Sheriff just wants it passed along. If anything turns up, I'll keep it in mind." He paid, loaded the mule, and rode west out of Red Rock Flats without looking back. Not because he wasn't tempted to look back, but because a man who looks back too many times tells everyone watching exactly how much he has to look back for. What no one in that dim store witnessed while they weighed their water concerns and ran their arithmetic was that Clem Baxter did not go home when the others did. He waited until Wade's dust was small enough on the western horizon to be ignored. Then he saddled his good horse, the one he kept for work that required reliability, and turned its head west, and followed at a distance that left exactly one day's dust between them. He'd tracked strays and men both in his time, and he knew how to follow without becoming part of the trail. He camped when Wade camped, moved when Wade moved, and on the third morning, when the Colton Trang Tri rose from the flat ahead, green and mended and visibly alive in all that dead country, Baxter went to ground on a low rise south of the property line and put his brass spyglass to his eye. He saw the fences, the garden in its curved rows, the squared barn. The new work on the south end of the house roof where two people had apparently been working the past week. He could see the color difference in the repaired sections. Then he saw the women, moving from the well to the workshop, from the garden to the barn, more than 20 of them, moving through the property with the ease of people who belong to it. And even at this distance, in the way they moved and held themselves and related to each other and to the space around them, he could read what he was seeing as clearly as a printed notice. He counted, recounted. The number made his breathing go shallow. The wire report in town. Apache women, missing from their people up north, a tribe searching with urgency and resources. And here, precisely here, on the only deep water property in 30 miles, precisely the women described. Baxter lay on the rise with the spyglass warming in his hand and turned the situation over the way he turned every situation over, examining all the faces, accounting the weight, identifying the buyers, because there were 3 buyers. The tribe up north, who would pay in goods and silver to have their women returned. Red Rock Flats, which was already nervous about the well and about strangers, and would pay in goodwill, and standing to a man who resolved the situation before it became a crisis. And the property itself, because if Wade Colton was found housing women the law was actively looking for, the legal and social weight of that finding might finally make a man reconsider a standing offer on 40 acres of prime water rights. 3 buyers. 1 secret, and Baxter holding the only thing all 3 of them wanted, which was the precise location where the women had gone to ground. He thought about the guns he'd run into the mountains 2 winters prior, when the army was watching the main trails and there were men with goods who needed a middleman with the nerve for it. He'd made the trip. The men he'd traded with the warriors who'd taken his stock and given back worked silver and cured hides knew his face, had done business with him, and a man whose face you know, whose word you have paid for once with real goods, is not a stranger you doubt. He was a known quantity to them, which meant when he came with a story, they would receive it as information rather than as a sales pitch. He could sell the same secret in 3 directions and collect from all 3. He meant to try. Baxter slid back off the rise on his elbows and went down to where horse waited in the wash below the ridgeline. He didn't point it toward town. He turned north and east, toward the high country, toward the lodges and the men he'd traded with before. Behind him, the Trang Tri went on with its evening as if nothing had changed, because nothing had yet. The women drew the last water of the day. The horses were settled. The garden grew in its careful channels in the last light, doing the slow, patient work of growing things in ground that had been told twice it was done with that. And Wade Colton rode the last miles home in the long gold of late afternoon, carrying flour and salt and the particular relief of a man who has done a hard thing without getting caught, and not one breath of warning from any direction about what Clem Baxter had just put in motion from a rise to the south, with a brass spyglass and a ledger full of debts he intended to collect. Wade arrived home on the afternoon of the third day back from Red Rock Flats to find the Trang Tri running without him the way a river runs without the person who dug the channel, not because the person isn't needed, but because the work they did before they left is what's doing the work now. Peter was at his stirrup before the roan had finished stopping. We worried. The road gave trouble? Town gave enough. He swung down. Stiff in the specific places a 3-day ride produces opinions. They're watching the water situation, and there's a wire report about Apache women moving through this territory. Sheriff Cross is asking after it. Words running through Red Rock Flats and picking up speed, he looked past Peter to where the others were gathering at the sound of his return, drawn in from the garden and the workshop and the yard by the particular alertness that people who have been waiting for bad news develop for the sound of hoofbeats. From here on, if anyone comes through that gate, everyone knows their position. Hired hands, settlement to the south, don't recall the name. Same story, every mouth, no exceptions. Peter carried it across an Apache, low and quick. The news moved through the assembled faces the way a wind moves through grass, not surprise exactly. More like the recognition of something that was always going to arrive, eventually arriving on schedule. Kiona stood at the barn door. She received the information the way she received most things that couldn't be changed directly, without flinching, with the immediate pivot of a person whose relationship to difficulty is functional rather than emotional. Her eyes found Wade's over the heads of the women between them, and what passed in that look was not reassurance and was not alarm. It was the acknowledgement between two people who have both decided to be present for whatever comes next. That was new. Wade noticed it was new. He unloaded the supplies with help he hadn't asked for, because asking wasn't required. 4 women materialized alongside him, and the mule and the work distributed itself without negotiation. Sacks moving from animal to storage with the efficiency of people who have been sharing labor long enough to read each other's intentions before they're acted on. He watched it happen and thought about the east fence, which he'd been fighting alone for 2 months before 10 women finished it in a morning, and understood something about the difference between a person's capacity and a person's circumstance. He'd been operating at about 30% of what this land could hold, not because he lacked the knowledge or the will, because he'd been one person, and one person on 40 acres of difficult ground in this climate was not a match for the ground. He'd been losing on purpose without knowing it was on purpose, arriving at a place where the land's demands exceeded his supply and calling that a life. The garden showed him this most plainly. 3 weeks after planting, the first things came up. Wade stood at the edge of it on a morning in early September and looked at shoots coming through the channels the women had cut, green and specific and entirely without apology for being alive in ground that had told him twice it was done with living things. The curved rows were already doing what they'd been designed to do. The one dew-heavy morning that week had left moisture in the channels, while the surrounding soil went dry within an hour of sunrise. He'd been planting in straight rows. Straight rows were what Kansas required, where rain came with some regularity, and the soil held moisture without help. In Arizona, straight rows gave water every direction to escape in. The curved channels gave it one direction down, into the root zone, where it could stay long enough to be used. 25 women from this desert had looked at his dead garden and read the problem in 5 minutes that he'd missed for 2 full seasons. He wasn't embarrassed by this. He was interested by it, the way a man is interested when he discovers there was information available that he didn't know to look for. Kiona found him at the garden's edge most evenings. Not by arrangement, not announced. She simply arrived the way she arrived everywhere, with the directness of someone who has decided where she's going and goes there without the surrounding performance of deciding. Some evenings they talked. Some evenings they stood in the cooling air and watched the light change on the plants, and said nothing, and the nothing was not uncomfortable in the way silences are uncomfortable between people who don't know each other well enough to share them. He was learning her English, not the vocabulary, which he already had, but the rhythm of it. The way she used pauses as punctuation. The way she placed certain words at the end of a sentence that in another person's mouth would have gone in the middle, giving them more weight by arriving last. The way she asked questions that were technically questions but carried the shape of statements she was giving him the option to confirm. She was learning his silences the same way. One evening, with the sun going down behind the western rocks and the garden throwing long shadows across the channels, she said, "You still don't name your horses?" "No. 3 years is a long time to work animals without names. They know what they are. They know what they are to themselves." She looked at the horses in the corral. "They don't know what they are to you." He thought about that for longer than he thought he was going to think about it. "I'll name them when I'm ready." "You'll name them," she said. "When you're ready to have things again." He didn't answer that. But he turned it over for days afterward, the way he turned the bracelet on his wrist, which he still hadn't removed, and hadn't decided to remove, and had stopped thinking about removing. Ruth came to him on a Tuesday evening, 3 weeks after his return from town. She arrived at the house step the way she arrived everywhere, without announcement, without hurry, settling beside him on the worn wood as if she'd been planning to sit there for some time, and was simply now doing it. She had a basket she was working on, the weave tight, and even in the particular way her hands worked things completely, with the attention of someone for whom half measures in craft were not a category. She worked in silence for a while. Wade let the silence stand. He'd learned that Ruth used silence the way a careful speaker uses pauses, not as absence but as part of the communication. Then she said, without preface, "You saw Ada. It wasn't an accusation. It was the statement of someone confirming a fact they've been tracking." "First morning," Wade said. "I know. She worked the basket, and you looked away. That's her business." Ruth was quiet for another stretch. The fire in the yard had gone down to coals, and the stars were beginning to assert themselves in the east. "She is 18 years old. The man they intended to give her to, he is the one whose marriage would have sealed the agreement her father made. He doesn't know about the child." Her hands moved, basket turning, the pattern developing with the patient logic of something designed rather than improvised. By custom, if he learns, the child belongs to him. Ada belongs to no one. Wade looked at the dark line of the barn where Ada was presumably sleeping or trying to sleep. "She's not going back." Ruth looked at him then. The first time in the conversation, she'd looked directly at him rather than at her work. Her expression did something brief and specific, the thing that people's faces do when they encounter exactly what they needed at the moment they needed it, before they've decided whether to show that. Then she looked back at the basket. "No," she agreed. "She is not." She stood after a moment, tucking the unfinished basket under her arm. Then, before she moved away, "I've been a healer among my people for 40 years. In those years I have kept many secrets. This one is heavier than most. Not because of what it contains, but because of what it could cost the girl if it came out wrong." A pause. "I am telling you because you already know half of it, and a man who knows half a secret is more dangerous than a man who knows none. Or a man who knows all of it. That depends on the man." She looked at him with the patient assessment of someone who has been evaluating this exact question for 3 weeks. "I have made my determination." She walked back toward the barn without waiting for his response, which was the most efficient form of trust he'd ever been shown, not requiring him to perform trustworthiness, simply proceeding on the assumption of it. He sat on the step for a long time after, looking at the stars and thinking about Ada, about Clara, about the specific weight of secrets that concern people who cannot entirely protect themselves. Then he went inside and went to bed, and in the morning he continued doing what he'd been doing, which was everything available to him. The supplies held through October. The garden produced past what Wade had thought possible from that ground tomatoes that arrived in volume, squash kept going fat in the shade of their own broad leaves, beans climbing the poles in disciplined green spirals. The workshop, which had been a room full of tools he'd mostly stopped using, had been claimed by 7 of the women and their looms, and the sound coming out of it during working hours was the sound of productive purpose, The specific rhythm of shuttles moving and cloth growing, and people doing something they were good at and knew they were good at. The weavings accumulated. Wade looked at them when he walked through the blankets folded against the wall. The worked cloth in patterns he had no frame of reference for, but that his eye registered as beautiful in the way the eye registers things that are made with skill and intention. Colors pulled from plants he couldn't always identify. Patterns that had logic in them, beyond decoration. The kind of design that reveals itself as more intricate the longer you look at it. He thought about the conversation at Silas Reed's store. About Grant Hooper and Big Dutch, and the legitimate worry about water and strangers. About the wire report that was running through Red Rock Flats and picking up texture as it ran. And he thought about the weavings and what the weavings represented, not just income, but evidence. Evidence that the people using his water were not taking from the county, but adding to it, which was a different conversation than the one currently running. He let the thinking develop without forcing it. On the 23rd day after his return from town, long enough that Baxter had ridden north, found the people he was looking for, conducted the negotiation he'd been planning, and ridden back south through the territory the dust came from the east, not Baxter's direction, the high country direction. The direction Wade had been watching since Kiona arrived and told him what was coming from it. 5 riders. He saw them from the roof, where he'd been doing a final check on the north end repair. They came in a line, moving with the economy of people who cover ground for practical purposes rather than dramatic ones. He identified them by how they sat their horses before he could make out faces, not townsmen. The specific uprightness of men for whom a horse is a working extension of themselves rather than transportation. His voice dropped across the yard before he'd fully decided to speak. Peter, east, 5 riders. Now, what happened in the following 30 seconds was something he didn't plan and couldn't have directed. The yard simply emptied. Not chaotically, the opposite of chaotically. The women dissolved into the buildings and behind the outbuildings and around the blind corners of the workshop with the organized silence of people who had rehearsed this without him knowing they'd rehearsed it. In 30 seconds, the yard held only Wade on the roof, the washing on the line, and the particular quality of stillness that comes from a space that has recently been full of activity and is pretending otherwise. He came down from the roof slowly, both hands visible. The riders pulled up 20 paces out. 5 Apache warriors, young men, the paint on their faces, the working kind rather than the ceremonial kind, weapons worn open and accessible. The man at the center walked his horse 1 step forward and stopped. Tohuno, the scar ran from his left temple down across his jaw on one side, old and clean, the mark of something survived rather than something still happening. Somewhere around 35 years old, with the specific contained energy of a man who is accustomed to being the most dangerous person in a given situation and has made his peace with that. His eyes didn't carry hostility. They carried purpose, which was a different thing entirely. We look for women. His English was deliberate, each word set down with the weight of a choice. 25 from our people. You have seen them. This is private land. Wade kept his voice at the temperature of a conversation about nothing consequential. Who's asking? I am Tohono. The eyes moved across the property, the fences, the garden in its curved rows, the barn with its closed door. These women took things that belonged to our community. They broke the arrangements made for them. The men who were prepared to receive them have been waiting. There are obligations not fulfilled. Haven't seen anyone out this way besides my own people. Wade held the man's gaze with the stillness of a man telling a specific kind of truth, the truth of what he was willing to claim in this moment, which was different from the truth of what existed. Higher on help now and then. Deserts wide. Tohuno's gaze had stopped traveling. It had landed on the garden, on the curved channels, on the specific pattern of the rows, and was reading what it found there the way a man reads a signature. Not straight rows. Not the pattern of a man farming alone in the Kansas style. The pattern of people who farm the way this desert requires farming, which was information that the garden was offering, whether Wade wanted it offered or not. Your garden is laid well for a man living alone, Tohono said. I work hard, no. Tohono stepped down from his horse. The 4 behind him followed. This is the work of many hands. Women's hands, by the understanding in those rows. He started moving toward the barn. You will not mind if we look. Wade moved. Not fast, measured, deliberate, placing himself in the path with the economy of a man who has decided on a position and is simply occupying it, no hand near his belt. The rifle was in the house and had been there since morning and was going to stay there, because the first man to reach for iron in this yard would prove to everyone watching that what was happening was the kind of thing iron was the right response to, and it wasn't. This is my land. You don't have the right to enter my barn. The four warriors behind Tohono shifted. Hands drifted. The afternoon balanced on an edge that had no cushion on either side. Tohono looked at Wade with the assessing regard of someone recalculating. You are one man, we are five. The women are in there, maybe, maybe not. Wade held the position. But I'll tell you what I know about women who ran far enough to reach here. They'll run again the first night you sleep, if you take them back by force. And then you'll have to find them again. And they'll run again after that. Because they walked 3 weeks across dying country to not go back, and people who will do that once will do it as many times as the situation requires. He paused. Or you could tell me what you actually came to say, and we can talk like men who have a problem to solve, rather than men who are about to make the problem worse. Tohono stood still with the specific stillness of someone conducting an internal argument they weren't going to let become visible. The barn door opened. Kiona walked out head level, shoulders back. Behind her, one by one, 24 women came through the door and formed a line at her back, and not one of them looked at the ground. Kiona looked at Tohono with the directness of someone who has known this moment was coming and has been deciding what to do with it. Since the first morning, she walked toward a stranger's well and pointed at the water. She spoke in Apache, not a plea, not an explanation, a statement of position, clear and formal, with the structure of something that has been prepared. Peter moved to Wade's shoulder and gave him the pieces in low English as they arrived. She says they left by their own choice, and they will stay or go by their own choice, said. She says the arrangements made for them were made without them, which makes the arrangements belong to the people who made them, not to the women they were made about. Peter's voice stayed quiet and steady. She says in the old ways, in the ways of their people, before those ways were bent out of shape by outside pressure, an Apache woman could refuse a match that was wrong for her. She had a voice in her own life. She had a road she could choose. A pause. And then she asks him. She asks when their people decided that the way of their enemies was worth more than the way of their ancestors. Tohono's jaw tightened. Something moved through his face that had the quality of a man confronting a truth he would have preferred to encounter at a different moment in a different context, without an audience. He looked at Kiona. He looked at the line of women behind her, not a mob, not a desperate cluster, but a formation, 24 women standing behind one with the alignment of people who have made a collective decision and are standing in it. He looked at Wade. If they are here by their own wanting, Tohono said, each word measured out like something being spent carefully. And if this man does not hold them by force, then the old ways say, I cannot take them. A pause. But hear me. Her father is not a man who bends as I bend today. He holds the peace agreement in both hands and he watches it come apart. In 30 days he will send others. Men who do not recall the old ways because they never learned them and have no interest in learning them now. He fixed his gaze on Wade with something that was not quite threat and not quite warning and was exactly the combination of both. 30 days. Use them, he mounted. The 4 warriors mounted. They rode east without looking back, and the dust they made going was the same color as the dust they'd made coming, and it looked completely different. When the sound of hoofbeats faded into the desert's permanent background of silence, Kiona turned and looked at Wade. He looked back. Neither of them said anything. The nothing was full. The 30 days ran faster near the end. That was the way of countdowns. They maintained a false evenness through the middle, and then accelerated in the final stretch. Like water that moves at one speed through a wide channel and a different speed when the channel narrows. But the days before the narrowing had a brightness to them that Wade, against his better judgment and perhaps against his nature, allowed himself to receive rather than deflect. The garden delivered, tomatoes arrived first, red and heavy and apologizing for nothing, hanging from the vines in clusters that made Wade stand at the garden's edge in the late afternoon and feel something he could only describe as vindicated on behalf of the dirt. The squash came next, fat and pale and abundantly present in the shade of their own leaves. Beans spiraled the poles in discipline. The curved channels held their moisture through the dry days that followed the single September rain, and what came out of them over the following weeks was what 25 women had known would come out of them when they knelt in the cracked dirt on their first morning here and read the soil with their palms. They'd been right about the ground. They'd been right about a number of things. The workshop ran full from early morning until the light failed. The looms produced cloth that accumulated against the walls in folded squares, blankets in patterns that had the quality of things designed by people who understood design as function rather than ornament. Worked cloth in colors pulled from plants Wade had walked past for 3 years without knowing what they were for. He began thinking about Red Rock Flats, about Silas Reed's store, and the conversation about strangers and water. About the specific difference between people who take from a resource and people who add to it, and which category 25 women running looms and growing food that exceeded one man's consumption fell into. The evenings on the porch step became a regular thing, not announced, not planned. Wade would finish whatever the day's last work was and find that he'd ended up at the front step, and Kiona would arrive with the unhurried certainty of someone who has determined where she will be, and simply arrives there. Some evenings Peter was nearby, available for translation if it was needed. More often it wasn't needed. Kiona's English had been careful and deliberate from the first day, chosen word by word, and what had changed over weeks of daily use was not the vocabulary but the confidence of it. She was the same speaker, using the same language, but with less space between the decision to say something and the saying of it. On one of these evenings, the fire in the yard down to coals, the stars doing their Arizona thing of overcrowding every available inch of sky, Wade said something he hadn't said to anyone in 3 years. My wife's name was Clara. He wasn't looking at Kiona when he said it. He was looking at the fire, at the orange-gray coals that held their heat long after the visible flame was gone. She used to sing when she cooked, nothing specific. Just sounds she made, like a conversation with whatever was in the pot. Kiona was quiet in the way she was quiet when she was receiving something rather than preparing to respond to it. She died in the winter of '81. My son too, Joseph. He was 4 years old. He turned the bracelet on his wrist without thinking about turning it. I rode 20 miles in a blizzard for medicine and came back to a quiet house. That's the whole story. That is not the whole story, Kiona said. That is where the story stopped. He looked at her then. You came here to put distance between yourself and the place where it stopped. She looked at the fire rather than at him, which made the words easier to hear, less like something aimed. You found a place empty enough to make the stopping feel like a choice instead of what it was. A pause, grief does that. It makes a man believe that going far enough is the same as going forward. Is there a difference? The difference is where you end up. She turned her head and looked at him directly. 3 years in this country and you hadn't named your horses. You hadn't fixed the south end of your roof. You were farming like a man who expected the farm to fail. She said it without judgment, as a series of observations rather than an indictment. You were not trying to build something. You were trying to last long enough that the not building wouldn't seem like a choice. He sat with that for a while. The coals held their heat. The stars burned overhead, and now, he said, now you are in a different argument with the fence. The corner of her mouth moved. You repaired your roof. He had repaired the roof. He went to bed that night with the specific unsettled feeling of a man who has looked at himself from an unfamiliar angle and seen something that changes the picture. Not bad. Just different. The way a room changes when someone opens a window that's been shut for a long time. 3 weeks after the night, Wade and Kiona sat by the cooling fire talking about Clara, the night that shifted something in the arrangement between them that had been tilting in that direction for a while. The fire came. Not the fire in the yard, the other kind. At 2 in the morning, on a night 23 days past Tohono's 30-day warning, the smell arrived before the sound. Wade came awake with his lungs first, his body already sitting up, already passing the information, already reaching the conclusion before his mind had assembled the words for it. He was across the bedroom and out the front door in the space of a breath, and the sight that met him in the yard stopped him for 2 full seconds before he was moving again. The grain store was burning, not just beginning to burn. Already committed to it, the fire had taken the walls with the confidence of something that had been given what it needed to be confident. Even in the first shock of it, Some part of Wade's mind that stayed functional under duress noted the quality of the burn. Too even, too fast, running too cleanly up the vertical surface of the side wall. Wood doesn't catch that way on its own. Wood that has been helped catches that way. He did not stop to confirm it. Water. Bucket line from the well. Move. The women came out of the house in the loose urgency of people pulled from sleep, and what they did in the following 30 seconds was not panic. It was the opposite of panic, the organized response of people who have been surviving emergencies together long enough that the response system runs on its own. The bucket line to the well assembled without direction. Hands went to handles. Water rose, passed down the line, hit the fire. More water rose. The line held its shape and its purpose even as the fire pushed back heat that was looking for reasons to stop things. Then from inside the burning building a sound, muffled. Somewhere between a cough and a cry. Human, and in there, which was the only information that mattered, Peter's face went the color of ash. Ada. She went in before we saw the fire. The finished weavings, the whole season's work, she went to move them away from the south wall where the damp gets in. Before any of us knew, Wade stripped a blanket from the line and soaked it in the nearest full bucket and threw it over his head and shoulders and went in. The interior was country he didn't have a map for. Heat that arrived not as sensation but as pressure. Smoke so dense and low that the difference between his eyes open and closed was a matter of degree rather than kind. He dropped to the floor where the thin layer of breathable air was doing its best to stay thin and called Ada's name into the roar of it. The fire answered. Ada didn't. He moved forward on hands and knees toward where he thought the back wall was, calling again, and then something came past him. Not something. Ruth. He understood it only as it was happening. Ruth, whose feet gave her trouble on uneven ground in the ordinary world, who moved at the deliberate pace of someone navigating a body that has been in service for 60-some years and knows every mile went past him in the smoke with the specific certainty of a person who knows exactly where they are going. A wet cloth over her face. No hesitation, Ruth had been the one 12 days before who had sent Ada to organize the finished weavings by size for transport, had walked through the grain store with her explaining the system, had known which corner Ada would go to when she went in to do the work. Ruth knew the interior of that building in the dark the way she knew the interior of her own pockets. She found Ada at the back left corner by the large loom, down on the floor with the smoke already in her. Wade heard it, the sound of someone being moved who couldn't be easily moved, and Ruth's voice, one word, in English, aimed backward over her shoulder at him like a command. Go. He caught Ada at the threshold. Pulled her clear. The women outside moved in around them immediately, taking Ada back from the doorway and into the air that didn't cost anything to breathe. Hands went to Ada's face and shoulders and the practiced assessment of people who know what to do with someone overcome by smoke. The Wade turned back, the roof let go. It was not a sound that built up or announced itself. It was simply there, a massive finality, the sound of a structure completing its decision, and the doorway through which he and Ruth and Ada had all just come was replaced by a wall of fire and falling timber with the instantaneous totality of a door slammed shut. He went for it anyway. Hands caught him before he reached it. Many hands, organized and determined, hauling him back as the heat stripped sensation from his forearms and replaced it with something that was going to be remembered differently in the morning. He fought the hands for a moment that lasted longer than it should have, the moment of a man whose body is trying to do something. His mind has already understood, is impossible but hasn't finished refusing yet, and then the hands held, and he stopped fighting, and the fire finished what it had started. They stood in the yard and watched it. And there was nothing in any of them, not all of them together, that could change what was happening on the other side of the wall of fire. Not strength, not will. Not the specific helplessness that is worse than ordinary helplessness because it arrives after you have already done everything available to you to do. The fire burned through the rest of the night. At dawn, when the structure had come down to its bones, and the bones had cooled enough to approach, they found Ruth near the front. Not at the back where she'd been working in the dark, near the front, near the door. Not running toward it, but positioned between it and the back of the store, with the specific geography of someone who had been making sure of something before she allowed herself to consider her own direction. Making sure of Ada's direction. They buried her beyond the east end of the garden, beyond the seed she'd helped plant, in the ground that her hands had been part of waking. The women sang over the grave, and Wade stood at the foot of it with the smell of smoke still in his clothes and felt the heat of his grief cool into something harder and more purposeful than grief. Because the oil on the side wall of the grain store was not an accident and was not a mystery. He'd seen the burn pattern in the first seconds, seen the way the fire ran too evenly up the vertical boards, the way it had started at the base and moved upward with the assurance of something that had been given a running start. He'd filed the information away because there was a person inside the building and the information could wait. The information had waited, and now, standing at Ruth's grave in the early morning with 24 women and Ada, and the curve of Ada's belly visible in the daylight for the first time, no longer wrapped in protective arms, just present, just real. Just the life Ruth had bought with her own Wade Colton allowed himself to be certain about what he already knew. Clem Baxter had ridden north to find the tribe, had traded his information for whatever he'd negotiated, had ridden back south, had come in the dark and thrown oil up the side of the grain store and set the match to it, to frighten them off the land, to clear the board before collecting from the other buyers. He'd done all of this with the patience of a man who believed the situation would eventually yield what he wanted if he applied the right pressure at the right time. He'd done all of this, and an old woman was in the ground. It wasn't the wood, Wade said. He said it quietly but with the flatness of certainty, looking at the grave. Someone put oil on those boards and lit it. Ruth is in this ground because of that. Because of someone who wanted us off this land badly enough to decide our lives were an acceptable cost of getting it. Keona looked at him across the raw earth. Her eyes asked the question without words. I know who. He looked at the ruined structure behind them, at the pale ash and the blackened timber bones, and he's going to answer for it. Not quietly, not privately. In front of everyone who needs to see it. He didn't say Baxter's name. He didn't need to. 2 women came to Peter that evening, and Peter came to Wade, and the conversation she carried to him was the hardest one since the morning the fire was found. They wanted to leave. The land was marked. Ruth was the 3rd death, and 3 was a number their tradition took seriously, and the only wisdom their tradition offered about such a number was to move. Wade called everyone to the grave, not to talk them into anything. He was clear about that with himself before he opened his mouth. He wasn't going to argue or persuade or make promises he couldn't keep about how things were going to be fine. He was going to tell them the truth about what he knew, which was the only thing he actually had to offer. I'm not going to ask you to stay, he said, and waited for Peter to carry it. You've bought more of this ground than I have, and I know it, and I won't stand here and pretend otherwise. He looked at the grave, then at the faces around him. But I'll tell you what I know about running, because I'm a person who ran and who lived inside what running bought me for 3 years, he told them. Not the way he'd told Keona gently, at the side of a fire, in the context of 2 people finding a language for the difficult things. He told them plainly, the way you tell people something when there isn't time for the gentle version. He told them about arriving at the emptiest place he could find and calling it safety and living inside that lie until 25 women walked up his road and made the lie too crowded to maintain. He told them that safety was not a place. He told them it had never been a place. He told them it was this people in a circle around the thing they had decided not to lose, which was not comfort and was not ease and was not guaranteed to succeed, but was the only version of safe that had ever actually been available to anyone. He looked at Ada. Ada's hands were on her belly, not crossed inward, not hiding, resting on the life that Ruth had run into a burning building to protect. The life that existed in this world right now because an old woman had made a specific decision about what direction to run when running was required. She didn't run away from the fire, Wade said. She ran toward it. For the youngest of you, and for the one who hasn't arrived yet. If she could do that with the feet she had, in the dark, at her age, then I am not going to stand at her grave and let her have done it for nothing. The 2 women who had wanted to leave looked at Ada. At the hands resting openly now. At the life those hands were resting on. They stayed, every one of them stayed. And that night the Trang tribe became something different than it had been in the morning. Not in any visible way the buildings were the same. The ground was the same. The grave was the same. But the people moving through it were different, in the way that people who have made a decision together are different from people who are simply occupying the same space. They had decided together. That meant they were a thing now, a specific thing with a specific shape, and things with specific shapes are harder to dismantle than collections of individuals who happen to be in proximity. The new grain store went up in 10 days, fresh timber, pale and bright against the weathered gray of the older buildings, the way new skin looks at the edge of a healing wound. A scar. But a scar is also evidence that something tried to stop you and the body refused. The new grain store stood for 2 weeks before anyone from outside the property saw it. In those 2 weeks, the Trang Trai rebuilt itself around the fact of Ruth's absence, the way a body rebuilds around a wound, not by replacing what was lost, because that wasn't possible, but by reorganizing what remained into a configuration that could function. The women who had been closest to Ruth took on the small daily things she had done, without announcing she was doing them, the way she banked the cook fire in the evenings to hold heat until morning, the specific poultice she kept ready for cuts and scrapes, the quiet positioning of herself near Ada, at the hours when Ada most needed someone near, without needing to ask for someone near. The knowledge didn't die with her. That was the thing Wade hadn't expected, and which taught him something about how certain kinds of wisdom travel not in books, not in formal instruction, but in proximity, in the daily watching of a person who knows things doing the things they know. Ruth had been teaching for 40 years without ever calling it teaching, and the people around her had been learning for 40 years without ever calling it learning, and the knowledge was distributed now through 24 women who each carried a portion of it, the way a river carries the memory of the rain that fed it. Ada carried the most. She moved through the days with the careful deliberateness of someone who has been given a responsibility she takes seriously, not heavy, not burdened, but present in the way that people become present when they understand they are accountable to something beyond themselves. Her arms no longer crossed inward. Her hands rested openly on the life she was carrying. And the other women moved around her with the specific adjustments of people who have incorporated someone's condition into their daily calculations without discussing it, but because discussing it would make it a problem, and it wasn't a problem. It was a fact. And facts in this place were things you worked with rather than things you lamented. Wade watched all of this from the ordinary distance of a man doing the ordinary work of his land. The anger about Baxter hadn't gone anywhere. It had simply changed its address, moved from the hot immediate place where grief keeps its earliest responses to the cooler, more organized place where a man stores things he intends to do something with when the timing is right. He knew what Baxter had done. He knew why. He knew the shape of what was coming. The 30-day window Tohono had given them was running out its last week. And Baxter was out there somewhere with his 3 sets of buyers and his spyglass and his calculations. And the convergence he'd been engineering since that afternoon on the rise south of the property line was getting close to the moment he'd designed it for. Wade let it get close, because the alternative was going after Baxter on Baxter's terms, which was riding out into the territory, looking for a man who had spent years making himself hard to find and easy to underestimate. And that was a fool's errand that would leave the Trang Trai without its only able-bodied man and 24 women, without the cover story that kept Red Rock Flats from asking the wrong questions at the wrong time. Better to be here when it arrived. Better to be standing in his own yard, on his own ground, with 24 women who had already survived things that should have killed them when Clem Baxter brought whatever he was bringing. In the meantime, the weavings, the workshop had not slowed. If anything, the weeks after Ruth's death had produced more finished work than the weeks before. Because grief in people who have survived serious quantities of it sometimes moves through the hands, becomes action, becomes the particular productivity of people who know that the dead are best honored by the living continuing to live well. The blankets and worked cloth accumulated against the workshop walls with a patient abundance that made the question of what to do with them increasingly practical. Wade started making the calculation out loud to Kiona one evening. We need to take a load to Red Rock Flats. He was looking at the workshop wall and doing arithmetic in his head. Not because we need the money yet, because people there need to see that this place is producing something they want. The water worry and the stranger worry run hot when there's nothing in the other side of the scale. Something to buy changes the arithmetic. Kiona looked at the wall of finished work. You think cloth will do that? I think people who are afraid of something they don't understand are less afraid of it once they've paid money for something it made. He turned the idea in his hands the way he turned useful things. The fear doesn't go away, but it has to share the space with wanting, and wanting is a louder voice. She was quiet for a moment. Then, when, next week, I'll take the wagon, he paused. You stay here, she didn't argue, which told him she'd already arrived at the same conclusion he had, that whatever was coming soon, and the Trang Tri needed everyone in it when it did. He loaded the wagon on a Monday morning, the pale new timber of the grain store behind him catching the early light. The finished weavings filled the wagon bed in careful stacks, blankets folded tight, worked cloth rolled and tied, the whole load representing 2 months of production from 7 looms running full days. He drove to Red Rock Flats in 3 days without incident. Silas Reed's store in the middle of a Thursday morning was the right place to start, which was where Wade had started on the last trip. And the difference between the last trip and this one was that this time he was bringing something to show, rather than something to hide. He pulled the first blanket from the wagon bed and carried it into the store and set it on the counter and unfolded it. And Silas Reed looked at it for a long moment with the expression of a man updating his model of what was possible. The blue ground with white stars worked through it at intervals that weren't random. The spacing had logic. Each star positioned in relation to the others, with the precision of someone who understood pattern as architecture rather than decoration. The color was pulled from something Wade didn't know the name of, a plant the women collected from the north-facing rocks, and it had a depth to it that store-bought dye didn't produce, Lord Silas said, quietly, as a genuine response rather than a performance. The store filled the way Silas Reed's store always filled when something worth filling for arrived. Grant Hooper, Big Dutch, 4 or 5 others, and Silas's wife appeared from the back, drawn by some instinct for textile that operated independently of whatever her husband was doing, and she stopped in the middle of the floor with the star blanket in her hands and looked at it the way people look at things they've already decided to keep. Sheriff Virgil Cross's wife came in while the third piece was being examined. She was a small woman with the contained energy of someone who accomplishes large things through consistency rather than force, and she went straight to the star blanket with the directness of a person who knows what she came for. She held it to her chest and looked at Wade. How much, he told her. She paid. Asked if there was more where that came from, he said. I can have another load out next month, she said. She'd send her husband to collect it, and Wade kept his expression at the same temperature it had been all morning, which was the temperature of a man conducting ordinary commerce. The money from that first load was more than 4 months of his prior output combined. Not dramatic wealth. Practical sufficiency, the difference between a Trang Tri that was surviving and a Trang Tri that was building, which was a different kind of ground to stand on. He drove home in 3 days and arrived to find everything exactly as he'd left it. Everything, and a new alertness in Peter's eyes when she met him at the gate that told him something had changed in the air while he was gone. Nothing came, she said, anticipating his question. But it's close. Kiona says she can feel it the way you feel weather before it arrives. Wade looked east. The horizon was clean. How long, she says, days. Not weeks. He nodded, and began unloading the wagon, and thought about the specific way that knowing something is coming changes the experience of the time before it comes, sharpens the edges of ordinary things, makes the present more present, strips away the comfortable assumption that tomorrow will resemble today. 3 days later, Sheriff Virgil Cross rode out. Cross came alone, which was the first piece of information. A sheriff who comes alone to a situation he suspects is complicated is a sheriff who has already made some portion of his decision and is coming to complete it rather than to investigate. Investigation requires witnesses and documentation. What Cross was doing was something else. He rode in at mid-morning on a Thursday, and the Trang Tri received him the way it received anyone who arrived from the east, with the organized calm of people who had rehearsed for this and had decided that the rehearsal was sufficient. Wade met him at the gate. Sheriff. Long way to come without sending word ahead. Didn't want to give anyone time to rearrange the furniture. Cross stepped down from his horse with the unhurried movement of a man who has been dismounting from horses for 40 years and stopped thinking about it. His eyes went over the property in a slow, professional sweep the garden. The workshop with its sounds of productive work coming through the open door, the new grain store pale against the old buildings, the grave beyond the garden's east end with its marker of worked oak. He looked at the grave for a moment. Fire? He asked. Arson? Wade said it the way you say things that are facts and that you intend to do something about. Someone put oil on the sideboards and struck a match. We lost a woman. She went in to bring out one of the younger ones. Cross looked at the grave for another moment with the expression of a man filing information. Then his eyes came back to Wade. I'll want details on that later. He looked at the workshop door. First, Wade walked him in. 7 women at their looms, the shuttles moving in the rhythm of work that has found its pace. The sound of it was a particular kind of productive sound, purposeful, specific, the sound of things being made. Cross stood in the doorway and looked at each of them with the methodical attention of a man doing his job, and then he looked at the work on the looms, and the work changed the look on his face in the way that encountering something of genuine quality changes a person's face, regardless of what they intended to feel. Kiona was at the center loom. She looked up when Cross's shadow reached her. She looked at him with the complete directness that was simply how she looked at things, and she held the look without performance or apology. And she put down her shuttle with the deliberate unhurry of someone who has decided that this moment deserves her full attention. Cross walked the length of the workshop, stopped in front of her, looked at her with the patient regard of a man who has been looking at truth and its various disguises for 30 years and has developed reliable instincts for the difference. Are you here because you chose to be? Kiona didn't reach for Pita. She answered in the English she had been building since the first morning, each word placed with the care she gave everything that mattered. This is my home now. We came here with nothing, and we built something here. Something worth staying for. Cross held her gaze for a beat that lasted long enough to be an answer in itself. Then he turned and walked back out, and Wade walked with him, and they stood in the yard in the late morning light with the sounds of the workshop behind them and the grave beyond the garden ahead of them. Cross looked at the grave again, then at the new grain store, then at the garden. He scratched his jaw. 30 years, he said finally. 30 years making decisions about who gets taken back to wherever they ran from, returning people to situations they chose to leave. I've done it more times than I can tell you, and a number of those times I drove home afterward and sat in my kitchen for longer than I needed to. Before I went to bed, he was quiet for a moment. The way I've come to see it, this late in the matter, if nobody is being harmed, if people are here by their own choosing, if what they're doing puts good into this county instead of taking it out, then who they are and where they came from is not my affair. And I will thank the next man who tells me it is. Relief moved through Wade the way water moves through ground that's been dry long enough to have forgotten what wet felt like, slowly at first, and then all at once, and then it was just there, present, doing what it was supposed to do. Keep it quiet out here, Cross said. Keep it clean. If anyone official comes from the territorial office with questions, I never said a word and neither did you. He settled his hat and the arson. You give me the details and I'll open a file. A woman died on this property in suspicious circumstances, and that's a matter of law regardless of anything else. I'll give you everything I have. Cross nodded. He was about to mount when he stopped, turned back with the expression of a man remembering something he'd been instructed not to forget. That star blanket Martha bought from you at Silas's store. She wants to know if custom orders are possible. Specific dimensions, specific colors. Wade almost smiled. Not quite, but close enough that Cross saw it and acknowledged it with a slight movement at the corner of his own mouth. Tell her yes. We'll work out the details. Cross rode east, and his departure left the Trang Tri with something it hadn't had since Tohono's 30-day warning, a form of official acknowledgement. Quiet and deniable, and worth more than a signed document in some respects, because it came from a man who had chosen it rather than a rule that required it. That evening, Wade sat on the porch step with the cooling air coming off the desert and thought about the specific difference between hiding and being protected, and understood that he had just moved from one category to the other. 2 days after Cross rode back to Red Rock Flats. The dust came from 2 directions. Wade saw it from the roof where he'd been doing a final inspection of the north end, repair the habit of checking work after completion. 18 years of professional thoroughness that had never left him. He saw the eastern dust first, because he always watched the east and the volume of it registered before he could count the source. Too much for 5 riders. Too much for 10. Then he saw the southern dust, smaller, 8 to 10 horses, moving with the organized gait of town horses, being ridden with purpose rather than urgency. The gap between the two groups was closing from different angles on the same point, which was his yard, which was not a coincidence, and was not going to resolve itself without his participation. He came down from the roof. He didn't run. He walked with the measured pace of a man going to meet something he knew was coming and had decided to meet standing up. He found Peter at the well, east and south. Coming together, he kept his voice level. Get Kiona, get Ada into the house, she stays inside no matter what she hears. Everyone else to their positions, Peter moved. The yard did what the yard had learned to do, organized itself, redistributed its population, became what it needed to become. Within 90 seconds, the visible surface of the Trang Trai was weighed, the washing on the line, and the particular quality of stillness that comes from a space that is fuller than it appears. The eastern group arrived first, 20 riders. He counted as they came into definition Apache warriors, the paint on their faces functional, weapons accessible. Tohono at the head of them, scar-faced and purposeful, on a horse that had covered serious ground recently and was doing its job anyway. Behind Tohono, the 20 were arranged with the specific formation of people moving together because they have been directed to, rather than because they want to, which told Wade something about how this particular group had been assembled and under whose authority. And then the southern group came around the east end of the garden, and at their head on a town horse that didn't fit him, dressed in the particular careful way of a man who wants to be taken seriously by both sets of people he's currently manipulating, Clem Baxter. The smile was finished for the first time. Wade had seen that smile half-built for 2 years, and now it was complete. And complete it was worse than half-built. Because it was the smile of a man who believes he is holding all the cards in a game where everyone else thinks they're playing something different. Baxter let his horse carry him to the center of the yard before he spoke, positioning himself between the two groups with the theatrical instinct of someone who has staged this in his mind enough times to know where he needs to be standing. Time to settle this, Colton. His voice went up and out with the carrying quality of someone who wants everyone present to hear exactly what he says. Tell the men from the north what you've been doing with their women. Tell the men from town what you've been doing with their water. Grant Hooper pushed to the front of the southern group. His face had the expression of a man who has been told something he found credible, and is now confronting the possibility that he may have been wrong to find it credible, and who is holding both things at once with the discomfort that produces. Caleb Wade, Baxter says you've got the chief's daughter held against her will out here. Says you've been running the well dry for a private camp. Tell me that's not what we rode out to find. Big Dutch behind him, rifle across his saddle, looking sick with something that wasn't fear, the specific expression of a man who doesn't want to be doing what he's doing, but has committed to doing it because he thought it was right. The yard held its breath. Baxter pressed. Go on. Explain yourself. Tell them how many people you're running at that well. Tell the chief's men what you did with his daughter. Wade did not reach for his belt. He did not turn toward the house where the rifle was. He did not look at Baxter. He turned his back on the southern group. He walked directly toward Tohono and the 20 riders, both hands open and at his sides, unhurried, covering the 20 paces between himself and 20 armed men the way a man covers ground he has decided to cover. He heard Baxter's voice shift behind him, a change in register, the first note of something that wasn't confidence, not fear yet. The first crack in the confidence, which was different. Tohono. Wade stopped 10 feet from the lead horse. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. You came to this property before. You stood where your horse is standing, and you asked these women yourself in your own language whether they were here by choice. You heard them answer. You made a judgment based on what you heard and what you saw. He held the man's gaze without pressure. Has anything they told you changed? Or did one man change it for them, from behind their backs, after he'd already decided what he wanted to collect from being right? Tohono's jaw moved. His eyes went past Wade to Baxter, and then back to Wade, and in the movement between those 2 points, something was being calculated that had nothing to do with the immediate situation and everything to do with a longer history. He told us you hold her against her will. Tohono said. He said she cannot speak for herself here. He said she has been taken. He said a number of things to a number of people. Wade kept his voice the temperature of a man explaining rather than arguing. He said different things to different people, all of them pointing in the direction that was most useful to him. That's the specific skill he has, a pause. You have eyes and ears, ask her yourself, same as before, and while you're listening to her answer, take a look at the man who told you the answer would be different, and think about what he was positioning himself to collect if you believed him. From somewhere behind the closed door of the house where Peter had taken Ada as instructed, came a sound that was not the sound of a woman being held against her will. It was the sound of nothing, which in this specific context was its own form of communication. Baxter heard the silence and made the mistake that overextended men make when the ground under them starts to shift. He pushed harder instead of stepping back. Don't listen to him, the voice went up, the control leaving it. Take the woman. That's what you came for, and then let me have what was promised. The word landed in the yard the way a stone lands in still water, the initial impact, and then the rings spreading outward, reaching every surface. Tohono heard it, the 20 warriors heard it. Grant Hooper and Big Dutch and the men from Red Rock Flats heard it, and what they heard was a man who had just confirmed, in one word, that there was a private arrangement between himself and the tribe that existed separately from any concern for justice or the women's welfare. Tohono turned his horse, not to leave, to face Baxter directly, which was a different movement entirely. You said promised. Tohono's voice had gone to the quiet register that serious things go to when they are being said by serious people. What was promised? To whom? By what right? Baxter's mouth opened. The recovery that came out of it was not smooth. The words had the character of improvisation, rather than preparation, which was the tell of a man whose plan had been built on a foundation that was now shifting. The reward the tribe put out a reward for information, I was due compensation for, 2 wins. Tohono's voice cut through without rising. You came to our people with rifles, through the back trails in the dark, when the army was watching the front ways. We traded with you. We were wrong to trade with you. We have carried that wrongness as ours. His eyes moved across Baxter with the slow assessment of a man writing a final accounting. You came to us with a story about this rancher. You came to these men from town with a different story about the same rancher. You made arrangements with both sides to collect from whichever one was left, with something left to collect. After the other had finished, he turned to the southern group. Hear me. His voice went up enough to reach every ear in the yard. This man brought your people a story that put your rancher in the wrong. He brought my people a different story that put the same rancher in the wrong. He aimed both stories at the same yard and waited outside for the results. A pause. The rancher holds no one, you can see it. Ask the women. The lie is his, not theirs and not this man's. The yard was very quiet for a moment, then Grant Hooper lowered his rifle. It was not a dramatic motion, he simply lowered it, the way you lower something when you've decided you were wrong to be holding it, and looked at Baxter with the expression of a man who has been used and knows it and is organizing what he intends to do about it. You set the fire, Grant said. Not a question. That woman who died in the grain store. That was you. Big Dutch said nothing. He moved his horse 2 steps sideways to block the gap in the ring of riders around Baxter, which was communication of a different kind. Baxter hauled his horse's head around. He didn't get far, the men from Red Rock Flats, the men he had ridden out here as his leverage. As the evidence of town authority that was supposed to give weight to his accusations, closed the ring around him with the organized purpose of people who have just understood how they've been used and have strong feelings about that. Grant Hooper rode alongside him. Big Dutch was already in front. Get down, Clem. Grant's voice had the flat authority of a man who is done with the conversation and has moved on to the next thing. We're going to talk about that fire, and we're going to talk about it in front of the sheriff. Baxter looked at the ring of faces around him and made the final calculation of a man who has run out of buyers. He found nothing in the arithmetic that helped him. He got down. Wade watched it happen from where he was standing 20 paces from Tohono's horse, in the space between both groups, on his own ground. He watched Baxter dismount and submit to the company of men who had ridden out to be his instruments and had become his problem, and he felt the specific kind of relief that is not joy and is not triumph, but is simply the cessation of a thing that has been building for a long time. Then he turned to Tohono. Tohono had stepped down from his horse. He stood on the ground now, which changed the scale of the interaction, made it a conversation between two men rather than an exchange across the distance that horses create. He looked at Wade with the measuring regard of someone arriving at a conclusion that has required more revision than he expected. The woman in that ground, he looked toward the grave beyond the garden. She died in the fire this man set. She went into it, Wade said, to bring out the youngest of them. The girl who's carrying a child, he let it stand without elaboration, because the elaboration wasn't necessary and wasn't his story to tell. Tohono looked at the grave for a long moment. The desert wind moved across the yard, and the plants in the garden moved with it and settled again. I will go back to her father. Tohono said it with the weight of someone who has been doing a difficult thing and is preparing to do the next difficult thing. I will tell him the truth of what I have seen here, what she has built, what was sacrificed to protect what she built. He looked at Wade directly. I cannot promise he will hear it. He is a man with strong convictions and a broken peace agreement, and those two things together make a man's ears narrow. But I will carry the truth myself, in my own words, and I will not let it pass through another mouth where it can be changed on the way. The gate stays open, Wade said it simply, meaning it simply. Anyone from her family who wants to come see what she's made here, they come with empty hands and they're welcome at the well. Same as anyone who has ever stood there thirsty. Tohono looked at him for a moment. Then he raised one hand, and 20 riders turned east as a single body and rode, and the dust they raised going was different from the dust they'd raised coming. Because the going was different, it was departure, clean and decided, rather than the loaded approach of something unresolved. Wade stood in the yard and watched them go until the desert flattened them back into the horizon. Behind him, Grant Hooper and Big Dutch, and the men from Red Rock Flats, were escorting Clem Baxter toward whatever accounting Red Rock Flats intended to conduct, which was the town's own legal business, and would be handled through Sheriff Cross's office, and would include the matter of a grain store fire and an old woman who had died in it. The details of that accounting were not Wade's to manage. He had given Cross the information about the oil and the burn pattern the morning after Cross's visit, and Cross had opened his file, and now the file had something to fill it with. The yard was quiet in the way it was quiet, after something large has moved through it and completed its movement. Kiona came out of the house. She crossed the yard toward him without hurry, and when she reached him, she stood beside him and looked east, where the dust was already thinning against the white sky, and neither of them spoke for a moment, because the moment was doing its own work and didn't need words added to it. Ada came out after her, moving with the deliberate care of someone navigating a body that is in the final weeks of carrying something it will not be carrying much longer. She stood in the afternoon light with her hands resting openly on the front of her dress and looked at the grave beyond the garden, and whatever she said in that moment to Ruth, if she said anything, if it was the kind of thing that gets said out loud or the kind that stays inside where it belongs, she said it privately, and Wade looked away and let her have the privacy of it. That night they built the fire in the yard, not a working fire. A fire built with the specific intention of gathering around it, rather than completing tasks by it, the kind of fire that a group of people builds when the day has contained something large enough that simply ending it without acknowledgement feels wrong. The garden provided what went on the plates, which was the specific satisfaction of eating from ground that had been written off and had declined to accept the assessment. The well provided the water, which was the water it had always provided, cold and consistent and unglamorous and entirely sufficient for everything required of it. Peter translated the evening's conversation in both directions, and the translations produced the sounds they usually produced: response. Laughter in the low, muffled variety that surfaces in people who have been keeping themselves contained through difficult things, and are finally in a place where containing themselves is no longer necessary. Kiona stood when the food was done and the fire was at its best height. She spoke in Apache, and Peter gave it to the fire-lit air in English without losing the shape of it. For beginnings that come from endings. For the family we build with our hands because the one we were given with our births did not fit what we turned out to be. For the woman in the ground beyond the garden who knew what mattered and ran toward it without being asked. For the water that started all of this by simply being what it was and staying what it was through everything that came after, she lifted her cup of plain water. For family, Wade said. He said it the way you say a word when you've been away from its meaning for long enough that returning to it requires something not dramatic, not loud, but real. The way returning to something real always requires something real in the saying of it. The word went around the fire. Later, when the fire had come down to coals and most of the women had gone in and the yard had settled into its nighttime version of itself, Wade sat on the step and let the day finish arriving in him. It arrived in the specific way that days containing large things arrive not all at once, but in sections, each piece presenting itself separately and requiring its own brief acknowledgement before the next one came. Kiona came out. She sat beside him without asking and without the performance of not asking, which was simply how she occupied space near him now, with the directness of someone who has decided that they are in a place and doesn't need to negotiate the decision repeatedly. Her shoulder against his, her hand finding his in the dark beside them on the step, not tentative, just certain, the bracelet on his wrist, the one he'd been wearing since the first afternoon, the one he hadn't removed and hadn't planned to remove and had stopped thinking about whether to remove, caught the last of the coal's light and held it briefly. Your father, Wade said. If Tohono carries the truth back the way he said he would, what happens then? I don't know. She's looked at the dark outline of the garden against the slightly less dark sky beyond it. My father is a man who has held a position for a long time and has organized much of his life around holding it. Men like that don't change positions because someone brings them information. They change positions because the position becomes impossible, a pause, or because someone they trust brings them truth, and they are, underneath everything else, a man who values truth. Which is it? I think it may be both. She looked deep, the direction she always looked. I think Tohono may be a man my father trusts. I think what Tohono saw here may be a truth my father cannot make impossible. She was quiet for a moment. But I stopped making plans that required my father to be a particular way when I walked out of the mountains 8 weeks ago. Whatever he decides, I am here. This is decided. Wade looked at the Trangtry around him in the dark, the garden he couldn't see but knew the shape of, the new grain store solid against the sky, the workshop with its looms, the grave beyond the garden's east end with its oak marker and its worked silver, 40 acres of hardpan and rock and difficulty, and the specific life that had grown up on it in 8 weeks when the right people were given water and a gate that stayed open. I'm going to name the horses tomorrow, he said. Kiona turned her head and looked at him in the dark. It's time, he said simply. She didn't say anything, but her hand tightened on his, brief and certain, the gesture of someone confirming a thing that needed confirming. And then they sat together in the cooling air, while the desert did its nighttime things around them and the stars did their overcrowded Arizona thing overhead. 1 week later, Peter came to him before dawn, just, come, he didn't ask. He followed. Ada was in the front room of the house, and the women around her had the organized quiet of people doing something they knew how to do and were doing it well, and Wade stopped in the doorway, and Peter put her hand on his arm and steered him back to the porch step with the gentle authority of someone managing a situation that doesn't require his participation. They sat on the step together while the sky ran its sequence from black to deep blue to the particular pink that precedes Arizona committing to another day. The desert made its pre-dawn sounds. Wade turned the bracelet on his wrist and didn't think about anything in particular, which was a thing he hadn't been able to do for 3 years, simply sit without the weight of all the things he was trying not to think about pressing in from every direction. Then from inside the house, a sound. He had heard this sound once before. In Kansas, in the spring of 1879, in a room that smelled of new wool and the particular anxious joy of something unprecedented about to happen. The sound announced itself as categorically different from every other sound, not louder, not sharper, just utterly distinct. The way certain things are distinct, because nothing else in the world is attempting to do what they're doing. A child drawing its first breath and expressing its opinion of the situation. Whit Wade sat on the step and the sound reached him and did what it did. Peter came out a few minutes later. Her eyes were bright in the early light, which was pink now, moving toward gold. A boy, her voice carried the warmth of someone delivering good news they've been holding for the right moment. Both of them well. He looked at the sky. He thought about Ruth, who had run into a burning building so that this morning could exist, who had positioned herself between a falling roof and a doorway to make sure the girl was clear, who had used the last of herself for this specific purpose and had succeeded at it completely. He thought about Clara, who had never gotten to know that the man she loved had eventually found his way back out of the ground he'd buried himself in, who would have had opinions about the bracelet on his wrist and the woman who'd made it, and whose opinions he had loved even when they were inconvenient. He thought about Joseph, who had gotten 4 years of a world that had genuinely not deserved him, and who had run through a kitchen with a wooden spoon once making the sound of someone who had just understood that existing was a remarkable thing to be doing. He thought about the well. 60 feet deep in the northwest corner, cold and consistent and entirely unchanged from the first day he'd looked into it and decided this was the place. Still running, still sufficient. The same well it had always been, doing what it had always done, which was simply be what it was, and let what needed to happen around it. Fiona came out and sat beside him, not saying anything. Her shoulder against his, her hand finding his in the morning light, the gesture that had become the gesture, not tentative, not performed, simply the way two people who have decided to be next to each other are next to each other. The sun cleared the eastern mountains with its usual conviction, and the light came across the garden and caught the silver on Ruth's marker and held there for a moment. She would say this is exactly why she went in, Fiona said. Low, and only for the two of them, she would be right. He closed his hand around hers. She generally was. They sat while the morning fully arrived around them, and inside the house a boy made his acquaintance with the world, and the world made its acquaintance with him. And the well in the northwest corner of 40 Arizona acres did what it had always done, which was hold its water and offer it to whoever came to the gate with empty hands. 3 months later, Tohono rode in from the east on a morning in November when the air had finally decided to behave like autumn. He came alone, hands empty and visible, the way Wade had said the way anyone was welcome who came that way. He rode through the gate that was open, the gate that stayed open, the gate that had been open since the morning 25 women walked up the track and changed the arithmetic of everything. The Trang-Tri that received him was not the Trang-Tri he had seen twice before. The garden was in its late-season state, the harvest mostly in, the plants going to their winter forms. The workshop was running. The new grain store stood solid. A second small structure had gone up south of the barn, a proper washhouse, Fiona's design, built by hands that knew what they were building. The grave beyond the garden had a border of stones around it now, placed with care, and the plants immediately around it were tended differently from the rest with the specific attention given to ground that holds someone. Fiona came out of the workshop when she heard the hoofbeats. Tohono stepped down and stood before her and produced from his coat a bundle wrapped in worked deerskin. He held it out. She took it and unwrapped it, and what was inside made her go still in the way she went still when something mattered past the point of immediate response. Wade didn't ask what it was. He could see from where he stood that it was something personal, something from her father's world, sent in through Tohono's hands, which meant Tohono had been received and had been heard, which meant the truth had traveled the distance it needed to travel and had arrived somewhere. Tohono spoke to Fiona in Apache, at some length, and she listened with the stillness of someone receiving information they have been waiting for, without letting themselves wait for it too visibly. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she nodded once, the motion of someone accepting a thing that has arrived in a form different from what they imagined but is nonetheless what they needed. Peter, standing close enough to hear, looked at Wade. Her father does not send his blessing, she said quietly. He is not a man who does that quickly, but he sends the bundle, which among their people means, she paused, finding the right English for it, means he acknowledges what she has built, means he will wait and watch rather than act, means the door between them is not closed, not forgiveness, not approval. A door left open, which was enough, which was in fact exactly enough, the same sufficiency that the well provided, the same sufficiency that 40 acres of hardpan provided when the right people were working it, the same sufficiency that 1 cup of water provided when it was given without condition to people who needed it. Enough, and enough was not nothing. Wade looked at Fiona, who was looking at the bundle in her hands with the expression of someone who has carried something for a long time, and has just been permitted to set it down without abandoning it, not gone, just resting. Just finding a new way to exist that didn't require her to hold it at the same height every moment of every day. He walked to the gate that had been standing open since morning. Since the morning 25 women had walked up his road, and he had stood in his own yard and made the only decision that mattered, which was not a complicated decision and had not required a complicated man, only a man willing to look at people who were thirsty and respond to what he saw rather than to what he feared. He put his hand on the gate, left it open the way he had from the beginning. The way he intended to leave it, not as a statement, not as a philosophy, not as anything that required a name larger than what it was. Just a gate, just open, just the specific daily choice of a man who had learned, the hard way and the long way around, that the distance between a closed door and an open one was about the width of one breath held and then released. And on the other side of that breath, if a person was willing to take it, everything. The desert morning came in bright and indifferent and entirely without interest in what any of them had just been through, because the desert is not sentimental and does not commemorate and has no opinion about human resolution. It simply continues. It expects continuation. Wade Colton continued. He had his 40 acres and his deep well and his 3 horses, who had names now: Clara, Joe, and the grey mare he'd named Ruth on the morning after the fire, because some names need to be carried forward by the living rather than left behind with the dead. He had a garden that grew in the curved channels of people who understood this ground. He had a workshop full of looms and a workshop full of women who knew what they were making and why it was worth making. He had a grave beyond the east end of the garden where a woman who had run across 3 weeks of dying country with seeds in her pocket rested in the ground she had helped wake up. He had a boy in the house who had been in the world for 3 months and had already developed opinions about it that he expressed with the full force of his available lung capacity at hours of his choosing. He had a bracelet on his wrist that he had never removed and did not intend to. And he had a woman beside him, had her the way you have things you didn't go looking for and found anyway. The way you have things that arrived in a form you didn't anticipate and turned out to be exactly what was required. Standing beside him at the open gate in the November morning, her shoulder against his, her eyes on the eastern horizon the way they were always on the eastern horizon, watching for what came next with the calm alertness of someone who has decided that what comes next is something she intends to be present for. The well was full. It was always full. That was the thing about this particular well, in this particular corner of a country that was always testing the proposition that things could grow in it. The water was there, and it was enough, and it had always been enough. And the only thing that had ever been required to make use of it was a gate left open and a bucket sent down without conditions attached to the pulling of it back up. Wade Colton had figured that out the hard way. He wasn't sorry it had taken him this long. He was just glad he'd figured it out.